Thank you so much for inviting me. So, I would like to talk about trauma today from a few different angles, and I would like to do this developmentally. So, how can we educate our children about trauma as early as the age of 4? Then, how do we add a little more nuance to the conversation when they reach the age of 7? And then, how do we move on from there with our teens, young adults, and beyond? Because that is, I believe, at least, how we should be teaching trauma to our children, uh, and how we should be teaching about consciousness in general to our children, which is to say, by starting simply in ways they can understand, and then slowly ratcheting up the complexity in alignment or in lockstep with their own arc of maturation. So let's begin by talking about trauma at the 4-year-old level. So at some point, your child's going to be in emotional or existential pain. Of course, we're not talking about catastrophic head trauma in this particular situation. This is emotional pain. And there'll be a moment where you're comforting them. And what you can do in this scenario is make a sweet little drawing of their bodies with a sad face. And you can ask them, where do you feel the pain? And of course, they'll point to their bellies, or their emotional heart in the center of their chest, or their head. And what you can do is take a paintbrush and paint a little blue dot on the little drawing where they said their pain was, of themselves and their bodies. And you say, sometimes we're in pain. We say that we're feeling blue. And they'll smile. And then you can draw a little mommy and daddy next to them. Mommy on the left, daddy on the right. And if you want, you can paint, the sun or God or Odin or Athena above them all. And then you can slowly begin to draw a bright yellow ray of light coming out of God, going through the hearts of mommy and daddy, which is very important, and then slowly entering into the blue dot inside the body of the little child. And as you do this, you can say, when you're blue, you can call in a golden healing energy of mommy and daddy and God and Athena, and you can guide it into the place where you feel blue. And what you will find is that the golden yellow energy will slowly turn the blue sadness into a healthy, healed green. And then the magic trick, of course, is that before their very eyes, you mix the yellow with the blue so that the dot indeed turns green. And boom, like to a 4-year-old, that's a mic drop. And it's the best way that I have found to symbolically indoctrinate a child at the unconscious level in the energetic transmutational process of healing trauma, period. Because you're not just telling them about the transmutational process of healing trauma, you're showing them. And they are seeing it take place at their level, at the 4-year-old level, as an irrefutable fact of reality before their very eyes. The blue turning green. And if anyone is interested, I actually have a children's book that illustrates just that. It's called something like Teaching Trauma to Kids, Book 1. And it's completely universal and non-denominational, and I invite you to check it out. Now, let's go to level 2. Your child is now 6 or 7 years old. And because you use the word trauma in your household regularly, because your whole family is traumatized and because that's normal, at some point your child would say, what's trauma, daddy? What's trauma, mommy? And you can say, well, I'm glad you asked. Trauma is what happens to us whenever we get really, really hurt and a part of us on the inside disappears. And they'll say, oh, well, where does it go? And you can say, well, it gets imprisoned in a deep, dark place inside of you called the unconscious. And they'll say, ooh. And the next time you find yourself in a situation that looks, sounds, or feels like that first situation where you got really hurt, you won't be able to respond normally to it. Because the part of you that would have responded normally to it is now in that really deep, dark place in prison. And in its place, a really weird part of you actually shows up from the prison that was born in the prison. How is it weird, Daddy? Well, it's weird because it's a bit like a big, empty, rusty suit of armor with a big iron helmet on. And it isn't very smart because it doesn't really have a brain. And it can't really see things very clearly because of that big helmet it's wearing. And you can't really control it very well because of all the heavy armor. And most of all, it isn't very nice because it came from that deep, dark place within the prison. And so this part of you now starts taking over your life in any of those areas that remind you of the time that you originally got really, really hurt. And even though it thinks it's trying to help you, it actually makes everything worse. Ooh, they say. And then you go on and you say, but you want to know what's even worse than that? What's even worse is that we don't even usually know that this little switcheroo is happening. Oh no. Whenever this happens to us, my dear, we usually have no idea it's taking place. And if someone tells us it's happening, we'll usually argue with them. And if pushed, we may even try and fight them. And by we mean the suit of armor, because the real us is in prison, right? And they'll say, well, what do we do, Daddy? And you say, I'm glad you asked. Well, either someone you trust has to tell you that this whole situation is happening, or you have to experience this situation where you disappear and the dumb, half-blind, empty suit of armor shows up over and over and over again until you realize that it's a pattern and that it's reoccurring in that particular scenario that reminds you of when you originally got hurt. And only then, having recognized it and seen all the ways it's making everything worse, only then can you begin to heal it. And how do you do that, Daddy? Such great questions. You're on fire today, kiddo. Well, once you've identified the situation where the suit of armor takes you over, you have to be brave enough to carefully go up to the suit of armor and start talking to it kindly and telling it that it's actually safe as long as it really is. And that perhaps you'd be happy to tell it a story and maybe even give it a hug and love on it a little bit. And what can happen if it's not actually being dangerous, which of course suits of armor can be, but if it's not, and you're brave enough to face it and kind enough to care for it, it will actually fall asleep and disappear back into the unconscious prison where it came from. And then the real you that was locked in the prison will slowly come back. And in that moment, healing has happened. And then hopefully they'll ask this question. But Daddy, what happens if we don't heal it? And then you say, I'm glad you asked that one too. Well, not healing our traumas is a real tragedy because the less we heal and the more we get hurt as a natural consequence of living life, the more parts of us will actually disappear. And the more our life will get taken over by the empty suits of armor. And some people have been so hurt, so traumatized, in fact, that the majority of them have disappeared and only the armor is left. And in the worst case scenarios, these people actually begin to believe that they are the empty suit of armor. And they completely forget that there was ever a time when there was a real them. You know, like your crazy racist Uncle Jimmy. You know, he's always in the suit of armor, isn't he? Mm-hmm, they'll say. Yeah, he's a zombie suit of armor, Daddy. And you say, well, yes, we don't like to use that term. That's a pejorative term. It's slightly more respectful to say daywalkers. But yes, Uncle Jimmy is a bit of a daywalker. But let's not forget that, you know, sometimes Daddy loses his temper too because he's tired or sad and he snaps at you or at Mommy. And in those moments, Daddy's a bit like a zombie suit of armor, isn't he? And it's the responsibility of Daddy to notice that and to always try and put the zombie suit of armor back to sleep and to bring back the nice, happy daddy from the unconscious. But it's also the responsibility of the entire family to notice when that happens to daddy or to mommy or to you, and to not punish any of us, but to care for us. Because those are the moments when we're all at our most fragile and vulnerable and need each other's love the most. And in fact, a fun family game that we can play is to see who notices when someone else becomes the zombie suit of armor and begins to care for them first, by inviting them to take a deep breath and check in with their bodies and their energetic hearts, and maybe even begin to access the real pain hiding underneath. Unless, of course, they're being a complete asshole like daddy sometimes, in which case we tell them to piss off and go to the gym. They say. So, the next time you see someone in the family wearing a zombie suit of armor, what do? That's right. We care for them until the real them comes back. That is how to educate young people in the family in how to work with trauma. But we're not done. Now let's go to level 3. How can we talk about trauma simply and concisely at the young adult level and even at the adult level? So, regardless of what healing path you choose, what modality you use, and some are better than others, some do the work for you, some do the work with you, some go deep, some are more shallow, and I do cover a lot of this in my transdisciplinary healer training for practitioners. But regardless which path you choose to take you down into the shadow of the valley of trauma, you will eventually find yourself doing 3 main things. Number 1, intellectual healing. Number 2, somatic healing. And number 3, embodied healing, or facing the repetition of your trauma in the world and correcting it. Now, overarchingly, what has been happening in the entire field of healing is that the psychological modalities like talk therapy and counseling don't quite understand the somatic piece. And the somatic piece don't always understand the depth psychological piece. And a huge amount of people don't understand the embodiment piece, in which we have to face the repetition of the trauma in the world, which is why things like clearings and cord cuttings only work temporarily. So let's briefly go over all 3 of these stages, starting with the intellectual. Intellectual healing is an essential stage and can't be skipped, and involves developing a more coherent, more empowering story of how and why the trauma took place, which I would say depth psychologically trained practitioners are probably the best at, and which always replaces what is usually a fragmented, incomplete, and disempowering version of what happened with a more holistic picture. Now, obviously, this new story doesn't change reality. It provides nuance, explanation for why the trauma took place in the larger context of the family and the lineage and the culture at large, which always in itself offers relief and greater empowerment, because you're providing an intellectual integrity to an area of the mind and the brain that has been disintegrated, which is what trauma does. It's an experience that literally shatters our predictable, comprehensible, and therefore safe reality within which we live. A classic and simple example of this would be to remember that whatever harm someone has inflicted upon us in some way has happened to them by someone else, going all the way back through the generations to the very beginning, which is what's known as the victim-perpetrator loop, and which we are now, as a civilization, finally coming to grips with, we hope. And in some way, the traumas we incur are not even personal, because it's an ancient phenomena that has been passed down through the generations as a way for us to actually metabolize the pain of living. And without learning how to metabolize your traumas, you will hurt people inevitably to expiate that pain and as a way of not healing it, but reducing its pressures upon you, which we can go into in more detail at a later date. But in brief, this is the most common way of dealing with trauma: suppression, repression, projection, and scapegoating. That has been the main staple for how we deal with trauma over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. Incidentally, Erich Neumann was probably the first to outline this in his book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. And that whole pathological process, that whole old ethic, is interrupted and transformed when we learn how to literally metabolize and dialysize and process our pain, which is the new ethic, and which is spoken about in all the great myths and scriptures as a prerequisite for the hero's journey, and what stage 2, the somatic piece, is all about. So let's talk about that. So anyone who works with trauma knows that first you talk, then you feel, and then you feel more deeply until you begin to open your awareness up to the latent, volatile, and unresolved energetic cysts within you. At that point, you're going to have to develop 2 specific skills. Firstly, the ability to access those latent emotions and wrap your awareness around them. And secondly, the ability to generate what I call antidotal emotions, capable of dissolving and healing those latent volatile ones, which is what the children's book at age 4 was already pointing to. And those are the 2 rudiments of emotional processing and what healing at the somatic level is all about. You are literally required to hold the hellfire of your trauma, aka your deepest emotional pain, in your awareness, in detail, which is a bit like bear hugging your deepest fear and whispering, "I love you," into its ear. It's a bit like sitting in a pile of your own energetic excrement and then having someone nearby say, "But can you love it?" And you think, "Can I love my excrement?" And then they say, "Yes, you can, and you must." And then you begin this internal contortionary process in which you learn to generate sparks of positive emotion that you then guide into the negative space of the energetic trauma wound, hopefully with support. And in the beginning, let's be clear, this feels awful. No one likes it. You're physically uncomfortable. You're usually crying. And all while you're doing this, a part of you is wondering if it's actually dangerous for your mental health, which of course it's not. In fact, it's the reverse. Not addressing it and doing this is what's dangerous. And not just to you, but to those you love, friends and followers on social media, people in traffic nearby you. That is, of course, on condition you're not biting off more than you can chew. Too early, with someone who doesn't know what they're doing, like many of the untrained people today who are guiding people on psychedelic journeys, for example. No judgment whatsoever, but I will say that I am one of the many practitioners out there who often has to clean up that kind of mess. Blessings to all. Now, regardless, this is the larger trend that I see in the psychosomatic field. We are all encroaching little by little upon deeper and deeper areas of our personal, collective, and ancestral trauma and processing it, as if finally cleaning house on our collective psychic space. And that is a wonderful thing. and it's not always going to be perfect. So now that you have intellectually understood the reasons why the trauma took place in the first instance, and the larger, you could say, systemic level and implications, and you've begun to somatically heal the tangled energetic trauma dynamics within the body, you will find yourself facing the third part of the healing journey, which is facing it, or I should say, refacing it in the world, or what I also call the embodiment phase. Now, because every trauma within you is an attractor site for that wound to reoccur over and over again, you will be, whether you like it or not, and whether you know it or not, forever calling that wound in and refacing it in small and large ways over the course of your life. This is a fact. It's what Freud referred to as the repetition compulsion. And it's why we repeat our traumas, why women find themselves in the same abusive relationship over and over again, why men will find themselves losing their temper and in the same dissociative states over and over again. Think children's book 2. And this is why we find partners who trigger our wounds. Not too much, we would hope, but not too little either. Just enough in the Goldilocks zone for them to be reawakened, surfaced, so that we can actually heal them. But there is a paradox to the repetition compulsion, because we repeat traumas because we are trying to both remember them and forget them. Allow me to explain that for a moment. You repeat your traumas to forget them, because every time you do that, you bury the original wound under a brand new abuse, which is the meaning of the fairy tale The Princess and the Pea by Hans Christian Andersen. The pea is her trauma, and no matter how many layers she covers it over with, she can still feel it. But we also repeat to remember, because repeating is apparently the only way the psyche can bring the original wound to our awareness in order to heal and reintegrate the part of us that was sheared off during the trauma in the first place. Sheared off, bagged, and dumped into that unconscious prison we were talking about. That part of us is usually called the exile. And when you reintegrate the exile, there is always a treasure that comes with it. And I will say, my dear friends and mentors, Diane Steinbrecher and Shannon Pernetti, wrote a wonderful book about this, one of the best in the field, called The Treasure Within. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend you get it. But the point is that in the embodiment phase of the healing trauma process, you will find yourself facing an echo of that original trauma again at some point in your daily life, in your relationships, at work, with your children. The trauma will show up everywhere in small and large ways. And so if your trauma involves your boundaries being crossed, or being abandoned, or neglected, you will face this again in your life over and over until you learn to meet it with the courage and the redemptive requisite skills that you did not possess when the trauma first took place. And when you succeed in facing it in that new and empowering way, holding your boundary when previously you would have dropped it, speaking up when previously you would have swallowed your words, or holding your temper when previously you would have blown up, a huge amount of healing will finally begin to take place. And when I work with people in this way, or when those I've trained work with people in this way, they move through all 3 of these stages. And when it's done correctly and comprehensively, it's truly a miracle to watch the healing that results. And so those are the stages in a nutshell. I hope they were useful to you. Take care.